I'm going to be very brief in introducing our two panelists. I think I'm also going to be a discussant, for which Jonathan promised me 2 cookies as opposed to 1, doing double duty. So I'm not going to really say anything substantive about this panel, other than that I think the 2 subjects, that is looking at the U.S. Side of things and looking at the regional side of things, number 1, they mesh very well, but number 2, they also mesh with the first panel in an important way. And I think we'll all be interested to hear how that is done. Jeff, I think you're going first, and I think we all know Jeffrey Bader, I guess the founding director of the Thornton Center, and the senior director at the NSC under President Obama for the first 2+ years, I guess. He's written, by the way, a wonderful book that accounting that period, which I think is probably available in the Brookings bookstore, and which is a great read. And then Jonathan Pollock, the current acting director of the Thornton Center, somebody, I must say, on a personal level, when he was out in the wilds of California, which is someplace beyond the Appalachians, I think, I used to turn to his writings when he was at RAND to really understand what was going on in Northeast Asia. I didn't know him then, but I was always, I found myself always in agreement, which of course meant his writing was really terrific. But without further ado, Jeff, please.
Thanks, Alan, and it's daunting coming up here after that first really outstanding panel, which had 3 presentations, which each took different perspectives on the situation in the wake of the Party Congress, and really complemented each other really magnificently. I'm going to say briefly at the outset how I see the current shape of the U.S.-China relationship. I see it as basically in decent shape. I don't see the downward spiral or rising confrontation that I read about frequently in the media and some scholarly commentary both in the United States and in China. To illustrate that, the New York Times over the weekend had an article about President Obama's current trip to Myanmar, Thailand, and Cambodia, and talked about it as a continuation of the contest, that's the word they used, with China. Now, if the New York Times sports section followed the same standards as the front page, then the Redskin game yesterday wasn't really against the Philadelphia Eagles, it was really against the Green Bay Packers. And one thing I learned in working at the White House is you can't do a trip to Asia, it doesn't matter where you go, and it has nothing to do with the countries you're visiting, it's about China. Even if in all the preparations, all the briefings of the president beforehand, all of the principals committee meetings, China is never mentioned. It's about China. I'm not sure what standard is being applied to determine what constitutes a good or a normal relationship. I've been involved in this relationship for over 3 decades, and I can't recall a time when it was easy or untroubled or without substantial frictions. Least perhaps in the 1980s, when we were both transfixed by the Soviet threat. But at no time since then has there been across-the-board cooperation on security and economic issues. That isn't to say that I'm not concerned about some aspects of the relationship right now. It's just that I don't see it as beyond the capacity of our leaders to manage issues in a way that allows the cooperative elements of the relationship to remain substantial and to avoid conflict. Perhaps that's not enough for people who don't like to live with uncertainty, or with relationships that don't fall neatly into the category of ally or enemy. But it's, in my view, the right way to think about the U.S.-China relationship in the real world. So what are the chief characteristics of the relationship at the moment when President Obama and General Secretary Xi will be dealing with in the months and years to come? First, as Secretary Clinton said in her speech at the U.S. Institute of Peace a few months ago, we are interdependent. That's the word she used. Our economies are interdependent. China holds $1.3 trillion in U.S. treasuries. U.S. companies have over $60 billion invested in China. Two-way trade is well over $500 billion. And this is a relationship, I think Larry Summers put it very well, Larry, who was mentioned earlier today. I've heard him say that he could picture a 21st century in which the United States and China prospered, or a 21st century in which the United States and China did not prosper, but he could not picture a 21st century in which one prospered and the other did not. Second, we have a fair degree of cooperation on the principal nuclear weapons threats, namely the Iranian and North Korean programs, though we do not agree on the proper mix of pressure and inducements. Third, we are both watching the Arab Spring, if that's what it's still called, with wariness, as we see negative consequences play out in Syria, spill over into Mali, Libya, and in Egypt's relationship with Israel. But the U.S. remains more prepared to align itself with forces of change, whatever the risks, while China is hostile to any actions that would violate its sacrosanct principle of respect for the sovereignty of existing governments. So we confront each other over Syria, but one cannot rule out evolution of the situation there that could alter U.S.-China-Russia confrontation, such as the situation in Gaza. Fourth, the three-way relationship among Beijing, Washington, and Taipei is positive and quiet as it has been in over 2 decades. Since that is the only issue on which there is any realistic prospect of armed conflict, that is no small thing. Fifth, the territorial disputes in the South China Sea and East China Sea are, in my view, the most troubling development. A Chinese confrontation with U.S. treaty allies, principally with Japan, creates serious tensions and introduce unpredictability into the U.S.-China relationship, as well as offering an image of China's rise that is unsettling to countries well beyond the concerned rivals. And finally, military deployments on both sides. I won't discuss those here since I believe Jonathan Pollock will do so in some depth in his presentation. So what should we expect in President Obama's second term and in Xi Jinping's first in the relationship? I think the main variable in the relationship, in my view, is China. President Obama has had 4 years to formulate and put in place an approach toward China. In broad terms, it is consistent with that of his predecessors since President Nixon. Its main features are a welcoming attitude towards China's rise and willingness to accept a larger role for China internationally, and insistence that China's rise be consistent with international law and norms, a deepened U.S. presence and engagements in the Asia-Pacific region, including in international organizations like the East Asia Summit, strengthened alliances and partnerships with China's neighbors, gradual development of military-to-military relations, openness to Chinese investment in the United States, avoidance of protectionist measures that rattle markets, but greater willingness than its predecessors to use trade remedies and WTO dispute mechanisms. There is little reason to expect a dramatic change in this approach in President Obama's second term. But Xi's approach to the relationship with the U.S. Is less clear. Before getting to that, let me just pick out the point that I think State Roy was talking about, and Chung Lee alluded to, who's going to hold the key foreign policy portfolios in China in the years to come. The names that Chung Lee mentioned on the Central Committee, I think, gives us a pretty good universe to look at. You know, Yang Jiechi, Wang Yi, Wang Guangyao, Wang Jiarui, and Zhang Zhejun are all Central Committee members. And Chung Lee, correct me if I'm wrong, Zhang Yesui is an alternate member of the Central Committee. So I think that's the universe to look at for a state councilor and foreign minister. I am not going to make a fool of myself and predict which one will be in which position. I had about a 75% rating and predicting the Politburo Standing Committee members, which was not that high. I was 100% on the U.S. election thanks to Nate Silver. But I'm not going to go out on a limb. What I would say about these characters, these individuals, if you look at all of them, I guess only two of them have deep, long-standing backgrounds in relations with the U.S., Yang Jiechi and Zhang Yesui. The others, Wang Yi has been mostly Japan and Korea and Taiwan. Wang Guangya has been international organizations and more lately Hong Kong. Wan Jiarei has been North Korea. Zhang Jun has been Asia. But that doesn't tell us very much. I mean, if I think back to the 1980s when we were wondering who was going to succeed Wu Shui-chen, I remember one of the names that came up was Chen Chi-chun. And Chen Chi-chun, what we knew about Chen Chi-chun was he was a Russia hand. He knew Eastern Europe. So there was an assumption on the part of sort of an easy assumption that he must be friendly to the Soviet Union. Well, on the contrary, Chen Chi-chun turned out to be a great steward of the U.S.-China relationship without a background in it. And more recently, Dai Bingguo has been state counselor overseeing the U.S.-China relationship. When I first met Dai before he moved up, when he was moving up, he had no real background in the U.S. relationship at all. And he has turned out to be really the foundation of the relationship in the last few years, despite not having that background. On the other hand, people who are associated with the United States often feel defensive within their system about that relationship. They feel they're potentially under attack, seen as America hands, as much as China hands in the 1950s, if you will, were under attack, and sometimes overcompensate. So one shouldn't assume much about any of these individuals, about what kind of positions they would take, except they are all pretty well steeped in broad foreign policy and in the relationship with the U.S., even if it isn't the birthright of some of them. In terms of Xi Jinping, I mean, I think State Roy absolutely nailed it in terms of the unpredictability of people who rise in these one-party systems as to how they're going to behave. There is no record to cite in terms of the relationship with the United States beyond Xi's rather successful visit to the United States, in which he performed well, showed some personality beyond what we're necessarily accustomed to seeing in general secretaries, but was generally on script, and that was not his script. So we don't know. Well, it's interesting to analyze the other foreign policy figures I mentioned and the other members of the Politburo Standing Committee. This is going to be Xi's policy, as I see it. I remember I went to Beijing in 1997 with Madeleine Albright. We happened to land there, I think, 1 or 2 days after Deng Xiaoping died. And Jiang Zemin was giving a funeral oration the next day. We met with Jiang at 9 p.m. And Jiang said to Secretary Albright that some years ago when he assumed the general secretaryship, that Deng had told him, "You are responsible for U.S.-China relations." That was a quote. And he made a big deal out of that. Basically, it was sort of passing the baton from Deng to Jiang. If I look at the last few years, this has been Hu Jintao's relationship. He's been helped, I think, by Dai Bingguo. I assume he's been hemmed in to some degree by the rest of the Standing Committee, but it's been fundamentally his relationship. I expect nothing less from Xi Jinping. The other members of the Standing Committee are interesting, but this is going to be Xi Jinping's relationship. There is one important respect in which I believe relations can be smooth in the next few years. Many Chinese intellectuals and some officials have reacted with alarm to President Obama's announcement of the U.S. pivot to Asia, the Asia-Pacific region, in November 2011. While the pivot or rebalancing should not, in my view, be seen as a strategy of containment of China, clearly some of the military steps associated with it, the deployment of Marines to Northern Australia, the plussing up of Navy resources in the Pacific, the formulation of means to foil anti-access strategies, the U.S. posture on South and East China Seas. These have thrown the Chinese off balance, just as they have been generally well received by other countries in the region. But by now, I think the Chinese should have absorbed the meaning of the rebalancing. There should not be more jolts from the U.S. side in the second term, I would guess. If you read or heard Tom Donilon's speech at CSIS the other day, previewing the president's trip to Asia, you will have heard and seen a vision that is essentially steady as she goes, not a preview of new dramatic or particularly dramatic military initiatives. The U.S. economy should be stronger in the next few years. China's growth has slowed from the blazing pace of 2000 to 2010 that accompanied and probably caused a lot of the assertiveness we've seen in Chinese foreign policy in the last few years. I would guess that the likely alteration of the slope of these two curves will mute some of the talk of American decline and Chinese dominance that has flourished in the last 5 years. And finally, I'd say the principal risk that I see that could lead to confrontation and serious deterioration of relations is the disputes in the South and East China Sea, particularly the East China Sea. Will China aggressively assert its territorial claims? Is it in a hurry to do so? Will it be pushed by nationalist voices at home against the better judgment of the leadership? If so, it is likely that U.S. alliances, particularly with Japan, will be strengthened and given a clear central mission of dealing with Chinese contingencies. This would lead to a different kind of U.S.-China relationship and a different kind of security framework in Asia. Thank you all very much. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Given that Jeff has done such a really outstanding job of reviewing the different trends and possibilities in the U.S.-China relationship, I'm going to set that issue aside in the time that I have and focus really on two questions, one of which Jeff touched on a little, one had been briefly alluded to in Chung Lee's remarks. I want to talk about the turnover in China's military leadership and what it, I think, may reveal about the shifting role of the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, in the Chinese policy process in the years to come. And then related to that, I will talk about questions pertaining to the regional security environment that Jeff has also just raised. Let me begin with the questions related to military leadership. Not unlike the turnover in the party, there has been a near total makeover in China's senior military leadership, reflecting again the dynamics that are there that Chung noted about how retirements are mandated at a particular age and so forth. So if we look today compared to where we were even only a few weeks ago, we see a change, major changes in the composition of the Central Military Commission. We see, of course, 2 new military members of the Politburo. We see Hu Jintao's decision to retire from leadership, noted both by Ken and by Chung, and potentially indications of the role that Xi Jinping might play with respect to military affairs. We have new leadership in all 4 general departments of the PLA, as well as new leadership of the 2nd Artillery and the Chinese Air Force. At the same time, it's important to note that those who were not promoted, there were 2 generals, both very high-ranking, both from ruling families, if you will, in China, who were associated with Bo Xilai, specifically Zhang Haiyang, who was political commissar of the 2nd Artillery, and General Liu Yuan, Zhang Haiyang is the son of Zhang Zhen, who was a very, very powerful figure in the Chinese military in the past, had been a member of the Politburo. And then, of course, General Liu Yuan, the son of Liu Shaoqi, who was political commissar of the General Logistics Department. Both of these officers did not receive promotions, obviously, and it reflects to me, I think, the continued effort to, in effect, consolidate in power professional military officers who are loyal to the party, not engaged in Chinese internal politics, and in this context, suggesting over time the gradual diminution of the dominant influence, the pervasively dominant influence of the ground forces in China's military. We can see this in a couple of respects, and of course related to this, the parallel rise of the Air Force, the Navy, and perhaps to an extent the Central Artillery. Let's just look, for example, at the two new members of the two new vice chair of the Central Military Commission. Chung alluded to them a bit before. One, General Fung, former commander of the Jinan military region. General Fung just did something very unusual. He jumped 2 grades. He had never previously served on the Central Military Commission. In this case, he leapfrogged, if you will, totally uncharacteristic in order to be promoted all the way up to vice chair of the CMC. The Jinan military region, I should note, has been the principal laboratory and location, the test bed, if you will, for trying on different kinds of concepts and doctrines related to military experimentation, related to major exercises that have been conducted there on a regular basis since the General Fung assumed the command of the Jinan military region in 2004. So he has a personal and a professional identification with major steps in innovation in the PLA. General Xu Qiliang, former commander of the Chinese Air Force, he has spoken and written extensively about the role of air and space power in future strategy that moves well beyond very, very traditional concepts of the dominance, if you will, of a kind of an air defense mentality in the PLA. No service chief previously has ever assumed this kind of leadership role in the past. So we have a significant shift, it seems to me, with these new leaders as well as the new leaders in the general departments and the Second Artillery. If we look, for example, to use one particular telling case, the new commander of the General Staff Department of the PLA, General Fung Hui. He's a graduate of the National Defense University. He is widely published on a range of topics in military journals and the like. He was the youngest of China's 7 military region commanders, having been put in charge of the Beijing military region in 2007. So all of these, I think, suggest to me a system that has become a bit more dynamic, certainly not following the established norms. Now, into this mix, let's look at Xi Jinping. As many have noted, Xi has a certain amount of military pedigree. In around 1980, he was the secretary, the Mishu, for Geng Biao, then the Minister of Defense of China, and an important political figure in his own right. It suggests to me that between this and some of his career background as a party official, he may prove a more influential figure in military policymaking than either Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao. We could also add to this his wife's career as a PLA singer, but he does have links into the PLA that his predecessors have not. These affiliations are family and through a variety of work experiences. He is therefore not nearly as much a stranger to the PLA. Ken Lieberthal noted before Xi's leadership of the Maritime Security Small Group. So he has been much more active, I think, in this area than people might realize. So it begs the issue. Is Xi the leader and advocate, if you will, for that the PLA has been waiting for? Even if the PLA did rather well under Hu Jintao, really seeing significant military modernization, significant increases in its funding levels, this suggests to me a different kind of relationship between the leader at the top and the services, perhaps including a much more hands-on role in the formulation of military policy. Not all of this, by the way, is necessarily happy news for the PLA. The question, for example, is will Xi Jinping put military corruption on his to-do list? We'll find out. We'll see the degree to which he is identified with that, but it highlights to me that his circumstances as General Secretary and as Chairman of the Military Commission necessarily put him in a different kind of position than his predecessors. The fact, in addition, that Jiang Zemin, of course, that Hu Jintao, unlike Jiang Zemin, will not continue as chairman of the Military Commission, really gives him additional opportunities and possibilities that his predecessor did not. Now let me switch quickly to questions related to the implications of China's military development and its relationship to Chinese foreign policy. As has been noted, 2012 was a very tumultuous year in Asia, not just for reasons related to political transitions in almost all the states of the region, but also in terms of what I'll call China's own military activism, most notably, of course, as Jeff Bader noted a moment ago, with respect to China's conduct and developments in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. In my view, these developments since the spring of 2012 have validated a more forward-leaning military establishment, though it is still obviously, I believe, the dutiful servant of the party leadership. To be sure, much of what we have observed in both of these domains has been more the activation of the different kinds of maritime capabilities, the white-hulled ships, if you will, not the gray-hulled ships. But these have quite simply redefined the status quo off the coast of China. We now see, whether with regard to the Scarborough Shoals in the Philippines or with regard to the Diaoyu Senkakus, what we see is, in effect, a permanent or an ongoing Chinese military presence or maritime presence in both domains. Effective control of Scarborough Shoal by China and the surrounding waters. And with respect to the Diaoyu/Senkakus, I can only quote from a foreign ministry spokesman on October 31st, who stated unequivocally, quote, "A fundamental change has already occurred in the Diaoyu Islands." So we now see daily patrols or near daily patrols of Chinese ships in nearby waters, suggesting to me that in an ironic way, this has been as much an opportunity for the maritime services as it has been a problem, if you will. At the same time, there are voices that bespeak of a kind of a harshness and a suspicion among the very few senior officers who have had occasion to speak publicly with respect to relations with the United States. I don't want to make more of this than I should, but it really bears consideration. The Vice President of the Academy of Military Science made some very, very harsh remarks publicly in Melbourne in October, in effect suggesting that there's an American hidden hand with respect to the tensions in both the South China Sea and the East China Sea, even as the United States, of course, insists that it does not take a stand in either of these areas on the respective claims. But that seems to be falling on some deaf ears in China. Now, of course, even with respect to the Vice President of the AMS who spoke in Australia, it's counterbalanced by what you will formulaic reiterations of defensive intent on China's part, insisting that China is not pursuing regional dominance or an exclusive Chinese regional order, that security cooperation of various forms remains the fundamental driving direction of the PLA, even as there are none too cryptic hints about the roles of external powers, guess who, in his view of injecting new tensions in the regional environment. All of this, again, is against the backdrop of an unsettled regional picture that have emerged over the past year or more. It will, I assume, be a major item for discussion at the East Asia Summit, which will take place, I guess, is it tomorrow, Jeff? I think, yeah. Now, the military in all of this, I think, is playing a larger role in how China presents its policy options. Certainly, there is an increased emphasis on the acquisition and development of new capabilities, even as, and this is telling as well, the U.S.-China military-to-military relationship has actually been much more active in recent months. Secretary Panetta, of course, was in China in September. And even, for example, when Xi Jinping was in the United States last January, he specifically wanted to pay a visit to the Pentagon, which he did. So it indicates that Xi is not necessarily distancing himself from this kind of a relationship. He may even see a kind of a value added in identifying with it. But the way that China is trying to improve its advantage, if you will, is to present itself as a much more credible force in this context. Now, would Xi Jinping be prepared to risk a major downturn in the U.S.-China relationship? For all the reasons that have been noted, I doubt this very, very seriously. But China has staked certain kinds of claims, literally and figuratively, that could very well reconfigure the regional environment for years to come, or at least enables China, in its own estimation, to better protect and assert its interests. So the question for the longer term is, how does the United States choose to react and respond? This is among the operative questions, it seems to me, that the Obama administration is going to face in coming years. Thank you very much for your time.
So my second role is to be a discussant, as it were, to following on these two terrific presentations. When Jonathan asked me to take on this role, I cautioned him that one problem would be that I would likely be in violent agreement with both of them, and that turns out, in fact, to be the case. So what is left to me really is to add a few comments to what's been said, not to pick at all at what they have said. Part of what I would point to, though, as I said at the outset, is that I think there is a meshing not only between these two presentations, but also with the first panel. And Jonathan's comments and Jeff's too point to the importance of the leadership issues that have just been before us in thinking about these questions. So I'm just going to tick off a few points to comment on. First, on the personal role of Xi Jinping, I agree that he really matters. I think there are two elements in foreign policy of nations that matter. One is national interest. That can change, but it changes very, very slowly. The other is the individual who comes to leadership with a different background, a different life experience, different set of values perhaps than his or her predecessor, and that makes a difference. Granted, you cannot rise in that particular system without having been acculturated, and as was pointed out, you don't, I think State made the point, you don't get to the top by expressing individual views that differ with the then current leadership, which you hope to succeed. And I think we can see, at least in the case of Hu Jintao, that on Taiwan policy, it mattered. I think he, on that issue in particular, forged a new consensus. He did so by adopting a couple of positions which allowed him to say, I'm in line with everything that's gone before. That is the essence of one China, and also not sitting by if there's any form of Taiwan independence. But I think he really did forge that consensus at the leadership level. And whether on that issue or another one, and I'll come to some of that, I think Xi Jinping is in a position to do this. I think we all have this question. It's a collective leadership, but primus inter pares is a phrase that's been used. I think that's apt. We just have to see whether, for example, the fact that you've got 5 lame ducks, if you will, sitting there, but if they're all sort of in the same group or more or less in the same group, can she guide them along policy lines that he favors? The question of the U.S. relationship sort of touches on everything that I see in the region and even beyond. The issue of mutual trust. People have talked a lot about that over the years, the lack of mutual trust, the existence of mutual strategic suspicion. What are we up to from the Chinese perspective? What are they up to from our perspective? The whole question of rebalancing. I see Jeff caved in and used pivot.
Slip of the tongue.
Slip of the tongue. It's fundamental. What I see, though, I think the point Jeff made is really right, and that is that there has been an adjustment, a recognition, I think, more than when it was first announced, that this is about more than China. It's about China, but it's about a lot more than China. It's about security, but it's about a lot more than security. And while I think there is still a debate going on in China, including within the PLA, about how much this policy is designed to constrain China's rise, to limit its power and influence, and how much it's about this larger set of American interests, I do think that it is not the consensus at this point that it is simply a way of controlling China's rise. But the question is, if we do have still a sense of mutual mistrust, how do we deal with that? I've long felt that we needed a real conversation at the topmost level, not where you sit there reading your talking points and so on, although I guess you start there, but where you try to have the leaders, and this is obviously prepared along the way at lower levels, to talk about what your ambitions are, your concerns are, your hopes about the other side in particular, and so on. I don't think one should overdo the value of dialogue, but I think without it, and that kind of frank dialogue, I would say, you're not likely to deal effectively with that question. With regard to the United States, I couldn't agree more with Jeff about the status of what's going on in terms of cross-Taiwan Strait issues at this point. It's certainly the calmest and the best it's been probably in 60 years. The question is where it goes from here and whether that creates any potential for problems in the U.S. relationship. I think that that is not likely except in the case of potential arms sales. And we've seen in the past that Beijing has tended to suspend usually military-to-military relationships, and after the last announcement of arms sales, in fact, the PRC took a rather more mild approach than it had previously, I think precisely because the things that were of greatest concern to them didn't get addressed, didn't get sold. Is that going to be the case throughout the administration? I think a lot of people think it is, but we'll have to see. In the meantime, I think that we saw in Hu Jintao's report to the Party Congress the first reference at that level, that is in a Party Congress report, reference to the 1992 consensus. Hu had talked about it before, but not in his 17th Party Congress report and so on. And he talked again, as he had at the 17th Party Congress in another context, about a peace accord. I don't think that necessarily means that you're going to have, in fact, if you take these two things together, a lot of pressure applied on Taiwan, which could then implicate U.S. interests, but I think that's something to watch. The Middle East, I would argue, is likely to loom somewhat larger in the U.S.-PRC relationship in the sense that if things really go off the tracks with regard to either Iran or Syria, or now with Israel's problems on the Gaza and so on, I think that both sides are going to be careful to try and work as well together as they can, but they don't look at things exactly the same way. And it will matter, I think, at least to the United States, if we find that things we think should get done at the United Nations or in other ways are being stymied by China. I'm not predicting that, but I would at least put a star next to that as a possibility. North Korea. I think we're going to see some renewed efforts over the next several months to see if there's a path forward with North Korea. I don't see the Obama administration changing the terms of engagement. And Sung Kim, our ambassador in Seoul, just reiterated that, in fact, we won't. But we will also have a new government in Seoul, which I think, no matter who wins, will be looking towards at least some more engagement. And that could indeed complicate things and involve both the U.S. And China, and I think we have to pay attention. Finally, on these issues, I think that the focus on the South China Sea, and particularly the East China Sea, is absolutely right. I think we see China is basically, if you talk privately to folks from the mainland, what you get is, we didn't start it. The Philippines started it at Scarborough Shoal or Hwayang, and the Japanese started it with regard to Senkaku Diaoyu. But as one said the other day, we fixed it. And that's, I think, a rather unfortunate attitude. But I think it may be all too accurate a reading of how at least some important people on the mainland look at what's going on. And I think I have nothing to add to what Jeff said about the possible involvement of the United States in this. I think one thing one could say is that attitudes here about what China is doing are not very positive. And so it's not only a matter of alliance engagement, which is real, but it's a matter of how people think about what China is up to and how it is behaving and could behave into the future. I guess I had a couple of questions or points to make with regard to Jonathan. He partly answered the one question. The big changes in military leadership was the question I always ask is, so what? And you partially answered that in terms of the rising role of the PLA Air Force. I'm not sure the Navy necessarily came out all that well in terms of personnel appointments, but I think clearly they are being given a greater role. And I think in terms of what you said about the island disputes and so on, that's pretty obvious. I do think that China is seeking to change the status quo, and the military, particularly the Navy, is going to play a fairly big role in that. Why don't I just leave it at that? Mm-hmm. And I'm now going back into moderator role, excuse me, so I'll be happy to take your questions. We don't have a lot of time, so let me ask you to make short questions, ask short questions, not make statements, if you could. I'll go ahead with Chris. Introduce yourself, say who you are once you get the microphone.
Thanks, Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. Wonderful discussions. I'm really relieved to hear that Jeff's love affair with the New York Times has not diminished since he left. Sorry.
I love the Nelson Report.
Sorry, Chris Nelson, Nelson Report, not the New York Times. It's so interesting that I hear guys operating at your level, which is the very highest of levels. You're saying, the Chinese are getting a better understanding of where we're coming from on this stuff, and but then when it's all wrapped up, you then say, well, here's what we're really worried about, and it sounds to me like you're really worried about, do they understand it or not? Jonathan mentioned that horrendous speech in Melbourne by the a senior Chinese military academic. I made a big deal out of it on my report. Just as a layman at this end of the information pile, I don't hear, nobody shows me any evidence that the Chinese are a little more understanding of what we're talking about with the pivot and what we're talking about with engagement, containment, and all that. That in fact they are adopting a much more negative interpretation of why we're doing what we're doing.
Ask your question.
So that's my question. What is it that you guys are seeing or hearing at the senior levels that aren't getting down to us folks down in the weeds? So why should we feel more optimistic about it?
Well, I'll take the first shot. First of all, I think one needs to keep an eye on how much of the rhetoric that we've seen diminishes now that the Party Congress is behind us. I don't know the answer to that, and I'm not going to make a prediction. But I think their system is not radically unlike ours in the sense that when you have a leadership change that's coming up, that nationalist views tend to be the coin of the realm. So what you alluded to, Chris, was a speech and rhetoric. Certainly in the Chinese system now, with the global times and different CCTV channels, more and more outlets, there are more and more actors who put their views out, and they tend to be on the nationalist side. That's, I guess, of concern, but not surprising. A couple of years ago when Dai Bingguo wrote his article, I think we had some hope that this would, reaffirming Deng Xiaoping's mantra, we hope that that would empower people of different views to feel that they could safely publish their views without being inundated with 30,000 pages of emails. But that has apparently not been the case. I mean, if you talk, look, I'm not reading classified material. I'm reading the same things you are. I've still got access, but I don't use it, thank you. If you're talking to senior U.S. officials, I think you are hearing an interpretation from their conversations with their Chinese counterparts, which is somewhat more sanguine than what one hears from General Luo Yuan or Colonel Dai Xu or people like that. It'd be nice if they said these things publicly. Maybe after the part of the Congress, we'll start to see that.
Jonathan, you want to add anything?
Yeah, just a couple of points. I think Jeff is absolutely correct that there is a private-public discrepancy from what I understand in terms of the interactions that U.S. officials have with Chinese counterparts, even on the mill-mill relationship, that it often has a different tone in that context. What was troubling to me in particular about this speech that Chris Nelson and I have both referred to is you're talking about a senior leader of one of China's most prominent military institutions. You're not talking about a retired officer. You're not talking about, if you will, for want of a better label, a military academic as such. This is somebody who sits high up within that particular military organization, and it was troubling. Now, a lot of that edge may indeed reflect, as Jeff has also noted, the kinds of things you have to sort of say and do and posture in a succession period. But this is really work that needs to be done if we are going to, on the one hand, get past a lot of these latent tensions and suspicions, and if we are going to find a way to avoid what I think would be an absolute disaster, and that is a militarization of the U.S.-China relationship. I know those are stark terms, but I could see missteps along the way or undue eagerness of one kind or another to rationalize and justify a much more intense military competition in a way that frankly would serve neither country's interests and, ironically enough, would stand in stark contrast to the efforts of the Obama administration to build a different kind of U.S. presence, not just military presence, in and around China. This is not, I mean, is China part of this story? Sure. Is it China directed as such in some kind of an explicit way? Not in the way I would see the characterizations in much of China's media. But it does indicate that the U.S. responds necessarily both to observe changes in Chinese behavior and as well to the expectations of many U.S. allies and partners in the region. So nobody is spoiling for a fight, but that's the way things can often happen. Frankly, my immediate concern would be of an incident or accident. I do, like Jeff, worry most about the tensions with Japan. This is just freighted with meaning at every possible level. I think it's much more consequential than what has or has not gone on in the South China Sea, although I'm troubled by both. Will China be of a mind to keep a lid on these tensions, to see whether or not there are ways you can back off the possibility of a confrontation? That's not for the U.S. alone to control, but it's something we're going to have to be very, very mindful of.
I just at one point, I'm sorry, don't come back to it, but Chris, you asked, what are we seeing that you're not seeing? I mean, one thing that, if we were seeing a sort of an unmitigated Chinese suspicion and concern about what the U.S. is up to, rather than a reflective approach, I think we'd see different rhetoric on Senkaku's Jiaoyu. What we're seeing is ferociously anti-Japanese rhetoric on the subject, but rather careful evaluations of the U.S. role on the subject. That's what we hear from visiting think tank people, and that's what we're seeing in the media. Now that creates its own problems for us, frankly, from a policy point of view, because of the U.S.-Japan relationship and the importance of our being closely aligned with Japan on alliance issues. But the Chinese rhetoric on the issue towards us has been far from extreme.
I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to take 3 questions at a time, and I don't know how many we'll get to. Jonathan, what's our witching hour?
We have to be out of here by noon.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to start with Mike McDevitt, John, and Eric.
Hi, Mike McDevitt from CNA. A question for Jeff and Jonathan, if you want to chime in. You said that you anticipated, based on Donald's comments the other day, that kind of the rebalance is now steady as you go for the future. Within the context of what we've just been talking about, the maritime issues and what have you, what's your sense of pressure from our friends and allies in the region about where's the beef? Because what we're actually moving into the Pacific or putting into the Pacific, or our posture changes, is not very big and is not very, in terms of capability, hugely escalatory in the eyes of Chinese. So would there be pressure from our friends to essentially put more capability in the region? And then that, of course, relates to the work report, as I understand it, where there was a call for China to develop as a maritime power, and that, in fact, you say Xi Jinping was in charge of the maritime working group, and so there is presumably some, those words may have been his, and what relationship will that have to pressure from our friends and allies to put more stuff in the Pacific?
John?
John Zand with CTI TV. Talking about the South China Sea or East China Sea disputes, as Alan alluded to, a lot of people in China do believe that the Chinese action in those two areas is not something that China actually initiated out of a grand plan, but rather a forced reaction to provocative acts by other countries, like in the case of the Philippines, arresting, chasing Chinese fishermen. In the case of the Diaoyu Islands dispute, it's the nationalization of the islands by Japan against repeated Chinese warnings. So, how do we resolve this? Does China have to back off? Can China back off? Are the Philippines and Japan at least partly to blame? I mean, how would the United States act as a neutral, peacekeeper? Thank you very much.
Okay, and then Eric McVaden here, and then to your left. And if you can keep your answer short, we get one more, at least one more round.
Okay.
Eric McVaden, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. The last exercise I can remember that we had with the PLA military, or the PLA, was about 2006, I think. Are we hopeless on that count? Can we have any prospect that you build some trust and confidence that way? I know the atmosphere certainly is not conducive now, but should we be trying to make it that way?
Okay, who wants to start?
In reverse order, actually, Eric, I think that there was one recent U.S.-China exercise in the Gulf of Aden. I mean, it very, very tellingly, that's, of course, where China has now deployed, I think, 12 or 13 counter-piracy deployments. I'm sorry? But whatever. But my point, very tellingly, that's far removed from the zones that we're discussing here. But it does indicate, at least at some level, I think, a kind of more of a self-confidence that some in the PLA have, perhaps born from their experiences in the counter-piracy operations, that it's not necessarily so noxious or whatever to think about other forms of cooperation with the United States in what is arguably a very, very sensitive, ongoing issue. On the blame game, John, yeah, I think that this has been mishandled by all parties. It does seem to me that China's stance has been highly reactive, almost feeling as if you have to err on the side of doing more rather to demonstrate just how serious you are. Now, none of us are party to the inner deliberations of the Chinese on this, but I think at some level this instilled a belief that we, China, that is to say, have to be better organized, better prepared to respond, ask questions later, do things now and ask questions later, creating, if you will, as I said before, not facts on the ground so much, but facts in the water that have really altered the dynamics. Now, it may well be that the Chinese believe, and I've heard some Chinese scholars assert this, that they feel that this is now kind of managed. I think Alan alluded to this, that they have the means at their disposal to sufficiently complicate life for others that it won't go from bad to worse. That may be the case, but that would depend very, very much on whether or not you would be able to avoid some kind of an incident, some kind of an event that would clearly be very, very troubling. And Mike, very good question. I think in so many respects, the challenge with China, maybe it's a challenge for all states, is that how do we try to impart seriously what we think our behavior and our intentions are, and does anyone really believe you? I mean, for example, if you take the case of China and Japan, the Japanese leadership is insistent, we didn't really want to do this, but boy, it would have been a whole hell of a lot worse if other things had happened, and they may well be right, but that doesn't really resonate with what is very much a domestic audience on these questions. I'm not talking so much about public pressures, but more how issues are deliberated within leaderships and judgments that they draw upon. And I think the answer is going to be the proof will have to be in the pudding. I think as the fuller range of the goals of a rebalancing strategy are laid out, that's something that's going to really require Chinese leaders to ponder more than a bit, because in essence, the president's trip right now is much more about political and economic factors, not about the military. You can still worst case those arguments, and I've seen some of those already, but I don't find them, frankly, very, very persuasive for all the reasons that Jeff noted before about the article in the New York Times.
Just a quick comment on each. Mike, on your question, Australia is cutting its defense budget. Japan, we'll see what the new government does in terms of its budget. The loud voices on security issues may not prevail when it gets down to actual budget. My own view, my own sense is, and I need to have more conversations on this, is that what countries in the region are looking for is not so much visible evidence of new systems, new capabilities as sustainment. What they want is a sense that the U.S. is there to stay, there to stay in the military sense, and that we have sustained capabilities. They're not necessarily looking for a spike. And John, your question, it's a great question on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm not sure it matters. What we're seeing is that the Chinese are moving the flag down the field, whether at their own initiative or because of the blunders of others. And that's the primary lesson of what's happened. And I don't know if they have a roadmap or a blueprint, a secret roadmap or blueprint, but I'm not sure it matters. They're going to find opportunities to do this, and they're going to, they claim to have changed the status quo in both the Philippines, both Scarborough Shoal and Sengaku Diaoyu. I remember some years ago they had a showdown. There was a standoff, which was not very well publicized, with the Indonesians in the Natuna area, where the Chinese came very close to firing on some Indonesian fishing vessels. but they did not change the status quo in that instance, okay? I think they went back to where they were before. Now we're seeing a different kind of Chinese behavior. And I think that's what we should all expect in the future. This is, let's say, I think, highly problematic. The U.S. position, particularly on the South China Sea, is we're not going to take a position on sovereignty, but we are going to take a position on coercion. And if there's going to be coercion, that's going to affect U.S. posture. That's going to affect U.S. relations with countries in the region. That's going to affect U.S. reactions and reactions of others. And it's going to affect how China's rise is perceived. Do they still care about that? One hopes so. We'll see.
Okay, we're going to take 3 more. Peter, you haven't had a question, and did you hear right here, the third one? Sorry, Ken, didn't see you.
Thank you. Pete Shetley, formerly from Brookings. Question is about cyber attacks. Some months ago, the White House, for the first time, labeled China and Russia as sources of cyber attacks against the U.S. And my question is whether this issue is likely to generate more trouble down the road.
Great. Also ask you to keep your question very short. We've got 5 minutes for questions and answers here.
Thank you. My name is Jeannie Nguyen from Voice of Vietnamese Americans, and I'd like to ask both Dr. Bader and Dr. Pollack about the South China Sea again. We know that President Obama has pointed out that he wanted a constructive and engaging China in the relationship. So both former Chairman Hu and the President talk about the rule of law, and with the current situation in the South China Sea, where do you see the rule of law ideas can meet? Should the U.S. ratify the UNCLOS? And also the second part you talk about is the alliances, and that is an asset of our policy. So where do you see the role of Vietnam as an alliance to the U.S. in the South China Sea?
Okay, thank you. And the last question here.
Thank you. My name is Mi Xiong. I'm with the Sozo Group. We haven't heard much about the subnational dialogue and the subnational relation development between U.S. and China. Although in the past 4 years, we did see the flourishing of this level of relation developing very fast. So I wonder, in looking up to the next 4 years, how much would you see that this kind of subnational relation can develop? Is there a possibility that this relation can be elevated into a higher level? And if so, in what kind of ways? Thank you.
Let me take the opportunity to give Ken a question as a panelist here, and then we'll go on.
Ken Lieberthal, just very quick question for Jonathan Pollack. Am I correct in interpreting what you said as saying one of the major developments in the military promotions is they have promoted people who are very innovative in their thinking? Or did I misread that?
No.
Okay.
Yes, that they have. In other words, they have promoted.
Why don't you just go ahead and
Sure.
address all of this? And we'll end with
No,
Jeff.
I do think that they have identified people who have been instrumental in different kinds of, at least at an implementation end or an experimentation end, on the shape of things to come and how military forces are put together and made more credible. On the questions of Vietnam, there were about 3 questions you really asked. Vietnam is not a U.S. ally. I think we throw around the term ally much, much too loosely in this world. Clearly, Vietnam has become a partner and a collaborator of the United States. I think much of that is to be encouraged. And the reasons for that, I think, although here again, it's, as Jeff noted before, people can say it's always all about China. There are inherent reasons why the United States wants to build a relationship with China that go well beyond China, and I think that they are part of a bigger story. That said, obviously, whether or not the framework within which the issues related to the South China Sea can be deliberated is going to be key. Now, I must say, from my own discussions with Chinese scholars and the like, you really get a sense that despite most characterizations of China's ambitions and the like, there is significant debate about China within China, because there's a recognition that, particularly with respect to the so-called 9-dash line. It has no standing in international law. If China is to abide by the stipulations and agreements that it has made, they have a credibility problem here. And it's recognized, I think, in some Chinese circles. We've been encouraged to be, dare I say, patient as China works its way through this. But I think it is the object of significant internal deliberation in China. And I would rather they be deliberating this than acting to make things potentially even worse.
Can I guess turn it to Jeff, or do you have an essential thing? Because
No, I'm fine.
your
I'm
witching
fine.
hour
I'm
is
fine.
Real fast. Number one, we should ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. There were 34 Republican senators before the election who said they opposed it. I don't know. I hope some of them have lost. I haven't looked at the numbers lately, but I hope. But also the political environment has changed in the United States. Perhaps there will be more of a disposition to do what the U.S. Navy wants us to do, what the Joint Chiefs of Staff wants us to do, what every former Secretary of State wants us to do, and what the U.S. business community wants us to do. What will give us moral standing in the South China Sea. It would seem obvious. On cyber, Ken Lieberthal has written a great monograph that I guess Brookings published. That would be good. You all should take a look at it. The short answer, Peter, to your question is yes, this is going to be a bigger and more difficult issue. It deserves more than 10 seconds, but it's particularly the attacks on U.S. corporations, U.S. intellectual property, I think is the core problem. Finally, on subnational dialogue, I think it's a very interesting subject and a great question. I think that there is a lot that can be done, particularly in the investment area, and related to that in the IPR area, that can be done more successfully at the subnational level than at the national level. Governors in the United States, governors and party secretaries in China really want to attract investment, often more than their national governments want to encourage it. And perhaps we can use leverage to improve IPR performance at the regional level in China, which is where the real problem lies. So I see real possibilities there.
Please join me in thanking this terrific panel.